Welcome to Wider Lens, a podcast brought to you by the Directors Guild of Canada in Ontario. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of socially conscious horror or elevated horror, two terms to describe how more and more films and television shows are exploring societal fears and inequalities in fantastical ways. Today on Wider Lens, we'll talk to Indigenous Directors Nyla Innuksuk.
My mom actually, when I left, she said, you have to promise me that if you go, you have to make the scariest movie I've ever seen.
And Danis Goulet, about using horror, science fiction, and fantasy to tell authentic, unique stories about the Indigenous experience.
I almost felt embarrassed at first that I was making a monster movie. I felt really free in the process. And I was like, oh my God, you can say whatever it is you want to say, but you can actually say it louder.
In Slashback, a group of teenage girls fight off alien doppelgangers, infiltrating their hometown of Pang, Nunavut. And in Night Raiders, a Cree mother in a dystopian near future joins an underground band of vigilantes in a quest to rescue her daughter from a state-run institution. In our conversation with Nyla and Danis, we're going to explore how Indigenous filmmakers are crafting a future in which their stories not only survive, but thrive. I'm Annie Bradley, and this is Wider Lens. So I think the biggest thing that people seem to really be interested in is how do people get to where they are? I think it seems to be sometimes a big mystery, and I think you both have really unique stories about how you came to sit in the director's chair. I'm going to start with you, Danis.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Saskatchewan, and my first job on a film set was in 1998 when Tasha Hubbard, who's an amazing filmmaker, hired me to be her assistant. And on day one, I was just like, this is what I want to do. Like, I love this. Like, I was enamored by set. I saw the lights and I saw the thing, and it was amazing. And it was also an all Indigenous, mostly Indigenous cast. It was a CBC miniseries about the Chief Big Bear and the signing of Treaty 6 on the prairies. And I was just like, had the best summer of my life. And then I moved out to Toronto and got into casting and continued to sort of climb that ladder. And then I was once in the room as a part of the casting team on a US television pilot. And it was at the very first opening scene of this script, an Indigenous woman walks out and like stands there stoically and silent over a waterfall. And then she sacrifices herself. And that was the opening scene of the script. It was like very Pocahontas, but also the fact that like the greatest value a Native woman could be on screen is to be silent and then die. So you're watching like this incredible actor come in, stoically stand there and die, and then just watch it over and over again. And I just remember this feeling of like shame and of like, I'm supposedly a part of the team that's helping support this go out into the world. And I was just like, you know, the power lies in the storytellers, the people writing this. Like, the actors can only do so much with the material that they're given, with the people directing it, or the people saying that this is what we want to portray about Indigenous people. And so I just had a penny drop moment where I was like, we have to tell our own stories. I looked around at the time and I was like, who's going to do this? And this was the early 2000s. And so there was just a moment where it was just like, instead of I've had this dream and like pathway to always be a director, it was more like that there was an imperative that someone had to do it. And I asked myself, why not me? And I don't know if I can do it, but someone has to try.
I did read something about the Idle No More movement. Did that add an element to your desire to get out there and tell your stories in your own way?
That moment changed the nature of the stories that I was telling. I felt like there was an awakening that was happening. Like, Idle No More was a protest movement that went all across Canada, and it was Indigenous people doing round dances in malls at the height of the Christmas shopping time. And so I was watching the live feeds of this happening all across the country, and I started to think about what it means to be seen and heard as an Indigenous person. And I just wanted to make something that had to do with our power and our voice.
It was a very challenging time, I think, for a lot of people, but it was a wonderful time to see that come to the light. Nyla, I know that you've worked heavily in the VR VFX space, which is in itself completely interesting because that's not a space that we normally attribute or go to for women, which is exciting in itself. And you even created an Inuit character for Marvel. But Slashback is your first feature. So Why did you want to go into the very challenging world of independent filmmaking?
Growing up, I got into movies really by being a fan. I love movies. I love horror movies in particular, ever since I was a kid. And I started making movies when I was a teenager with my friend, and my cousins were used to getting doused in blood or dressing up as ghosts and stuff. So it was something that I always really loved, but I knew that it was a job, and I definitely loved these kind of American Hollywood directors. But I thought that I had to make a decision right then about the rest of my life. And for me, I knew that I loved horror movies, but it seemed a little irresponsible to kind of just be focusing my life on this passion I had as a teenager, and that going to film school, even though I thought that maybe I should be doing something more important, that this was something that was important to me. And so my mom, actually, when I left, she said, you have to promise me that if you go, you have to make the scariest movie I've ever seen. It kind of was a bit of a winding road to finally getting to the point where I felt confident enough to direct my own thing. And even then, it was at a crisis point. I really was dealing with some health issues and was originally pitching Slashback as something that I was writing and producing. And then it really took this health thing in my life for me to be like, whoa, wait a minute. I want to be directing this. This is what I should be doing. It was kind of crazy for me that it took that to kind of get over this fear, that almost the thing that was the scariest thing was saying, I want to do this big dream that lots of people have and not a lot of people get to do.
Both of these films are genre by nature. And I think this is really fascinating, and I want to kind of dig into this because, you've said, Nyla, that you've been a fan of horror movies for a long, long time. I'm wondering what really drew you to the genre. What was the framework of that genre that you felt could empower the story that you wanted to tell? Maybe I'll start with Danis.
Well, first off, I fell into genre by accident. So I made a genre film right before Night Raider, not right before, but it was my last short before I made Night Raiders. And prior to that, I had just done dramas. And so I was very much into independent film and also very entrenched in the festival circuit. So a commission came up to make a short film, and I was curious about the idea of putting characters from classic Cree stories on the screen. And the two characters were Wisagi and Wheatigo, and they're both supernatural. So as soon as you have supernatural beings as your main characters, you're automatically in the fantasy genre, which wasn't actually my intent. I was just I didn't go I want to make a genre film. I was I want to make a story about these two characters because they're always treated as so quaint and folkloric and of the past. And to me, I grew up hearing these stories around the fire, and they had gravity and power, and sometimes they were scary, the way a horror movie would feel. And I almost felt embarrassed at first that I was making a monster movie. I was just okay, this is weird. It isn't me, but I'm going to do it. I felt really free in the process. And I was oh my God, you can say whatever it is you want to say, but you can actually say it louder, because you're not constrained by reality. And also sometimes the weight of reality, especially when it comes to experiences of trauma, and especially collective trauma. It's one thing when there's an individual, but when you're talking about things as massive as colonization, it's genre actually offers something. It offers a layer of protection, but it also offers a fresh entry point for people, a touchstone to say, I invite you into the story, and I'm going to take you on a very exciting ride with monsters or dystopian cities. And so, yeah, for Night Raiders, it really just as soon as I made Wakening, I was oh my God, this is the space I want to be in. And I love it. And it allows me to say what I want to say loudly without feeling constrained. It's a post-apocalyptic world. It imagines everything that's already happened in history to Indigenous people. So nothing in it is actually imaginary. It's all true. It's just set in an imaginary future. But really, at its heart, it's about what happens to families when you take children away from their parents and the impact of that on individuals emotionally, but also just the cultural implications of that, which was obviously an allegory for residential schools. It is hard for people to take in the truth of residential schools and the profound impact that that's had. And so, I feel like let's Trojan horse it, where we come at it in a different way. Hopefully people can just relate to universally what would it be like as a mother to have to give up your child.
I think you've nailed it there, because I think it opens it up to such an audience. It feels like there's a very strong message there, and it's very powerful. How would you feel if your child was taken away? Every mother, no matter where you come from or who you are, can understand, or parent can understand that pain. And I think it was a very beyond clever, a very artistic way of getting that message across, which I think leads me right back into Slashback, because Nyla, you can talk about this, a land under siege, alien invaders, all of these sort of metaphors and allegories that are in Slashback were very, very powerful, and the uprising of the girls and the empowerment. So maybe you just want to talk a little bit about that and how you came to the idea and setting it in Pang.
I mean, Pang is absolutely stunning. The idea to kind of set it there was really just like a dream for me. Like I fell in love with this community, this place, when I had made a documentary really in my early 20s. I think I was still in college when I made a documentary with the National Film Board about this tradition of square dancing that still exists in Pang. In these pockets of the Arctic, there are these communities where square dancing, accordion music, fiddle music is considered Inuit tradition. And it really was brought over by the whalers in the 1800s, and instruments were left in the communities, and these dances were passed down. And I had visited the community a long time ago and absolutely fallen in love with the community, but also the physical landscape. It's unlike anywhere else. I'd visited Nunavut in the Arctic. My home community of Igloolik is so beautiful, but very flat. And Pang is so different. It's these gigantic fjords, these crazy mountains and that jut out of this landscape. My nephews are also from Pang. They're 5 and 7 years old now. So the idea of being able to make the kind of movie that I watched when I was a kid in their hometown was something that I thought was really cool. I knew I wanted to make a movie that could just be really fun, that was a fun adventure, horror kind of coming of age movie, if that's the mashup of genres that makes sense, about these kids fighting aliens. I knew that already that people, particularly Southern audiences, and by that I mean anyone that's not from the Arctic, we call from the South, and that audiences would see this and would see these teenagers from this Indigenous community taking on this invading threat, and that there would be this layer of the metaphor of colonization would kind of be applied to that almost without us doing anything at all. And so I really wanted to be subtle about that sort of thing, knowing that it could get heavy-handed just because people come into watching an Indigenous movie a certain way. And hearing some early responses about Slashback, I've noticed that people are surprised, calling the girls very modern, which is really interesting to me because they're just normal teenagers. But I think when I was hanging out with these kids in particular doing research for the script, we'd be going hunting and out fishing and going to cabins, and all they would be talking about is boys and girls in their class and all of this gossip. And so it was just, teenagers being teenagers.
I like to think about this. We all thought that, when Thelma and Louise came out, like that was it. We'd done it. Everything had shifted, and we're still trying to have strong female characters in movies and television series. It is getting better, but it's been this long process. I would say, like in genre, there's been strong female characters, but usually they're the ones that get killed first, also in horror, et cetera. And it was so exciting to see these very nuanced, very powerful in very different ways than we normally see powerful women.
Yeah, I think it's like strength and resilience manifest in many different ways. Where I grew up and in my family on my Cree Métis side, if you go up to northern communities, it's like people tend to be shyer and more understated. But I think from a Euro-Western perspective, sometimes their leadership style is undervalued. And I was trying to avoid the warrior trope that feels one-dimensional. And so I really tried to cast against type, in terms of this idea of what a warrior woman, especially the Indigenous trope of that, would be and would look like. And I think one of the central questions of the film is really, what does it mean not only to survive, but to thrive. And part of that is to know that you have worth and that you're worthy of love and of relationships and of community. And there was also many other female like it's a very matriarchal film. Like the elder is a matriarch, this incredible woman played by Elder Pauline Shirt, and Gail Maurice, who plays the camp leader, and Violet Nelson, who plays Somanus. And Violet is like a completely, like she just has so much on-screen presence. And I think we are all familiar with the strong female character from, like the early 80s action movies, a la James Cameron, and that was a really important development if you look at the progression of representation. But I feel like we also want to continue to transcend like tropes and to find different ways of portraying the nuance that you talked about, so that we're not putting like just an idea of a strong woman or like an one-dimensional strong woman, or even putting a weak woman or a flawed woman or a messy woman or whatever we want to express.
It feels like Indigenous film is finally having a moment, which is long overdue, obviously. It's so wonderful as a Canadian to see those stories being told. I know as a female director myself, when I walk on the floor, I feel like I have the weight on my shoulders of having to be excellent so that every other woman that walks in behind me, we're still breaking those preconceived notions about things. Do you feel a pressure that you carry the weight of your culture on your shoulders and that you have to succeed at everything you do?
I definitely feel that it's really intense, and especially because I've been around since, like I moved to Toronto in the early 2000s and got involved with Imaginative, and I saw the time where you could count on one hand, like maybe there were one Indigenous feature, Indigenous made, like with an Indigenous person in a key creative role as a writer, director, or producer. It's like we knew what it felt like to walk into a room and feel invisible, or when you said we need to be at the helm of our own stories, and you'd be met with blank stares and kind of like questions around why is that even important, but we knew it was important because when I did get involved with Imaginative in those early days, I knew how it felt to recognize myself on the screen, and you don't realize how hungry you are for that your entire life until you get to bear witness to it. And I think we still have a lot of ground to break, but this moment did not happen by accident. It's on the shoulders of decades of advocacy and of pushes for the creation of the Indigenous Screen Office, for pointed campaigns, people speaking truth to power, people being in rooms saying like this isn't good enough over and over again. And there's been some really important developments like the ISO's creation, and also the creation of a targeted stream at Telefilm that went directly to Indigenous feature film production, which happened about 5 years ago. That directly related to the proliferation of the work that we're seeing now. So you need the agencies, you need the power players in the industry to be on board with a collective vision that we've been dreaming about for a long, long time. But when you get that opportunity, do you feel the pressure that it better be good or there's not going to be the other one coming after you? 100%. And it's why it is so important, like who you're choosing as your collaborators, because you want to have people that are on a like-minded mission and also that know how to support the specific context of what it is to be making an Indigenous film. Like a film set is a workplace, but it is also what we're doing in this project has a mission and it has an agenda. And I will not only be transparent about that agenda, I'll be very loud about it. And so, like we did a mandatory half-day training for the entire crew about colonization. And I feel like light bulbs went off where people were like, oh, this is what this film is. This is what it's trying to do.
I think, Nyla, you worked in this very collaborative way, so this very organic way with the community. And, it was very important for you to have the respect of the community to do this project and to tell this story?
It definitely is a lot about how you go about making the project, and that when you're working specifically, like we were in an Indigenous community that's very remote and has some specific issues, like there's not enough housing for the residents, let alone this huge crew that's going to be coming in and being this big imposition. And what was so great for me when we were making the project, Pathways and Protocols had just come out. And so, there is a lot of advocacy work that goes into producing a movie when you're trying to make it in a certain way and have people from the community be involved, and for mentorship to happen within all of the departments, because that's going to take time and money. And that's often what you don't have a lot of. So to have this Pathways and Protocols document that could just basically be doing the work for me and explaining this is what we have to do. And it's not just coming from me, it's coming from all of these people that we respect. And so being able to have that was, I think, very, very helpful, just as an initial kind of guide to going into the community and ensuring that when we were asking permission from the community, the council, that we were requesting permission in English and Inuktitut, that we visited the community just to really make sure that this would be something that would be possible and that we actually were wanted there and that the community wanted to help us make the movie. And all of that capacity building work that we're doing so that there's more people able to make projects in the future and that we're able to hire more Indigenous crew to make our movies. Because as Danis also mentioned, there is lots of pressure about just being, when there is only, a handful of people making movies, the pressure. I remember actually watching Jeff's Blood Quantum, I think what came out at the 2019 TIFF, which was a couple of weeks after I got back from filming Slashback. And so to be able to watch that, I was like, oh, thank goodness, it's really good. It did feel like there was like, at least it gives me a bit of wiggle room to mess up.
We would like to acknowledge that we are situated in Takaranto and are grateful to be working on this land. We acknowledge the land that we are recording this podcast on today is the colonized territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis. We also acknowledge that Takaranto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. These treaties and other agreements, including the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, are agreements to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Other Indigenous nations, Europeans, and newcomers were invited into this covenant in the spirit of respect, peace, and friendship. We acknowledge and share our gratitude to the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada, caregivers of the land, and keepers of its stories for thousands of years. This podcast was produced by Katie Jensen and Michal Stein at Vocal Fry Studios. Our video producer is John Packman. Our executive producer is Anne-Marie Stewart. And special thanks to Aviva Cohen and Laura DiGirolamo at DGC Ontario. And I'm your host, Annie Bradley. We'll see you next time on Wider Lens.